John Park here, and welcome back to the studio home of the Rubicon Project. The topic I want to talk to you about today is guitar tones. So I thought we'd start right back at the very beginning of my guitar journey, when I got my first guitar and my first amplifier. The first amplifier I owned was made by a company called Ohm, and it was an Ohm Tramp practice amplifier. Little 10-watt amplifier. These things really only became available in the 1980s. Before then, you had these massive big tube amps, and the only way to get a good sound out of them was to turn them up really, really loud. Now that's not great when you're living in student flats. So these 10-watt practice amps were excellent. They were transistor based, and they had two really important controls. They had a preamp and a master volume. Now the trick to getting a rock distortion sound is to turn the preamp really quite high up and then turn the master volume down low. And what that does is it pushes the front end of the amplifier to create distortion, and the master volume means that you can listen at sensible levels without having to deafen your neighbours. This setup worked pretty well for me. I'm not going to talk about the guitars that I used. I'm just going to focus on the amps, because I think the amp is probably the thing that's more important in terms of determining your tone. So I had the Tramp for about a year, and then found that as I got better as a player, I needed to have a little bit more control over what the amplifier was doing. So I bought a PV Bandit. These amps were everywhere in the 80s. Everybody used them. They were accessible and very, very high quality in terms of both the build but also the sound. This amp had two channels. There was a lead channel and a rhythm channel. Now that became really handy because as you get better as a player, you want to play guitar solos, and you need a different sound for the guitar solo than you would use for the main rhythm part. So this amplifier had two channels. It had a lot more control over the EQ, the bass, middle and treble on the channels as well, and you could change the gain on the lead channel versus the gain on the rhythm channel. It was a great amplifier. At this time, there was the evolution of the boutique transistor amp, and these became really quite highly sought after because transistor amps were robust. They didn't break like valves often did. So you started to get these higher end transistor amps, and the one that I migrated to was the Sessionette 75. A lot of the top bands were using these, and it also had two channels, but the distortion channel on the Sessionette was really wasn't good at all, but the clean sounds from the amp were fabulous. So because I only had one channel and it was clean, I had to get into the realms of guitar pedals to start getting a decent guitar sound. And the first pedal I bought was the Boss HM2, which I still have to this day. This is an original Boss HM2 from around 1984. And I used that to get my distortion sound. I had a clean amp, turned that pedal on, and I got a very 1980s heavy rock distortion sound. Then I decided I needed a little bit more in terms of the sound I was getting. So to tighten the sound up on the clean amp settings, I used a Boss compression sustainer. It was also handy in the solos because it gives you a little bit extra sustain for those kind of lead guitar parts. But this went at the very front of my chain. Then came the heavy metal pedal, and then I invested in a Boss Dimension C, which is a chorus pedal, but it's a chorus pedal with a difference because it does add the classic chorus effect, but it adds a bit of expansiveness as well. And this pedal on button number 1 is pretty much all I use for my chorus sound. Even today, I use digital emulations of it in my computer, but it's this chorus sound that I've used consistently through my playing career. To give me a bit more depth to the sound, I had a Boss digital delay. And this just basically gives me some echoes and repeats. And I probably overused this in the early days because Complicated delays are a good way of covering up if you're not as good a player. If you're a bit sloppy, digital delay is worth its weight in gold in making you sound better. These days I use a lot less delay, but back then I would probably use this on 440 milliseconds and set to be like on the beat. One of the magic things about music is a lot of songs are recorded at 120 beats per minute. So 440 milliseconds is almost like a beat every half beat. So it's generally close to being in sync with a lot of the music that I was playing, which worked out pretty well because it meant I didn't have to change the settings very often. So that worked great with the Sessionette. And then I got the chance of what I thought then was the amp of a lifetime. And that was a Roland Jazz Chorus 60. One came up second hand in my local guitar store. And my wife, or she wasn't my wife at the time, she was my girlfriend, she actually bought that amplifier for me. And that was the amp that I used really for the main part of my, what I would call the learning phase of my playing career, when I was really starting to get good as a guitarist. And it was a totally clean amp, again transistor, but had a really expansive sound. And I just basically used these pedals in front of it. I used to get some great Pink Floyd sounds. The Delicate Sound of Thunder album, I played that a lot, playing along with Dave Gilmour's live guitar tracks. And he actually used, Dave Gilmour used a Boss HM2 in his rig on that tour. So my sound was bang on the Pink Floyd sound of that era. Then I got my first job. I moved to Newcastle and I took all that kit down with me, and I started to get into the realms of home recording. And I had a real problem in that miking up an amplifier is really difficult. You've got a great sound from amplifiers in the room, but when you mic them up, it's a different story. Now the reason is, when you're in a room, you've got two ears, so you hear the sound from the speaker of the amplifier, but you also hear the sound bouncing off the walls, and it gives you like a natural reverberation effect. Now, when you mic up an amplifier, you lose all of that spatial information. All you get is the information that's coming from the bit of the microphone that's pointing at the speaker cones. To get bigger sound, you use multiple microphones and you get a bit of room sound, but for what I was doing in my bedroom, that was completely useless. So what I got into, because I had a bit more money, was I got my first valve amp. And it was a Marshall GMP1 preamp with a Marshall GFX unit to provide the effects unit, some really good effects in that unit. And I ran it through a 9100 power amp with EL34 valves and a Marshall cabinet speaker. So I had the quintessential rock sound of the 80s, the Marshall sound. And it was a great amp. I used that amplifier for probably around 10 years. And I used it for all of the work I did when I was learning how to compose my own music, how to do other people's cover versions. Because the great thing about that setup was I didn't have to mic up the amplifier. The JMP1 had a direct out on the back of the preamp that gave you an emulated mic'd up amplifier sound. So it was kind of everything in a box. You got the live sound in the room, but you also got a very, very good sound into the mix. And I just used one of the presets. I think it was either preset 7 or preset 8 on the JMP1, and I used that for all of my sounds for probably, a good 10 years. There was a lot of other sounds in that preamp, but I just kind of focused on having that really, really solid lead sound. Then everything changed for me around the year 2000, 2001. I discovered Mesa Boogie amps. Now, I'd heard about Mesa Boogie amps and how they were the holy grail of amplifiers, but I'd never owned one. But by now I was earning decent money, so I could afford to buy a really, really good Mesa Boogie amplifier. So I bought a Mesa Boogie Nomad 55, all valve again. But this amp had 3 distinct channels. There was a clean channel, a crunch channel for slightly pushed over driven sounds, and then a proper heavy rhythm channel. And each of those channels had 2 different voices, and they had separate tone controls that you could use to get 3 very, very different guitar sounds for clean, crunch and rhythm, but get them consistently. The other fabulous thing about Mesa Boogie amps is they have an incredibly strong bass end and a very, very tight, clear top end. Now, I find Marshalls are a bit too mid-rangey for me. They sound a bit nasal and fuzzy. They sound fabulous in a mix, but in a live room, they were okay, but they weren't what I was looking for. What I was looking for was the Mesa Boogie sound, because it had that really strong mid-range sound, but the bottom end gave it a low-end rumble so that when you were playing, you could really feel the bass notes, which made you want to play differently as a player because you wanted to dig in more, because the amp responded better to that. The same was true with the top end. You just got this clarity throughout the mix. And I used that amplifier for everything when I was playing live in the room. I even used it for a live gig once, and had it mic'd up to do a creativity gig with loads of students where I played a couple of the tracks of the new album. But I never used that amplifier for any of my recording work. Now, at this time I was starting to get ideas for songs. I'd begun to write a song called Wilderness Way, and I thought, if I'm going to get this down, I need something that's going to help. And at this time, Line 6 came on the scene. I owned the very, very first Line 6 pod, which was designed to be every guitar amplifier sound you could want in a kidney-based box that would sit on your desk. And it was a very, very good piece of kit, but it never gave me the sound that I wanted for in a mix. That all changed when Line 6 produced this. So this device here is the Line 6 Pod XT Pro, the first rack-mountable digital guitar amplifier. And it's a little noisy, as you can hear. But it basically came with a full rack-mountable unit with lots more controls over all of the different elements. It also had built-in digital effects. You can see here, there's a stomp box, which could be in my case, would be an Ibanez Tube Screamer, modulation for chorus and flanging effects, delay, and then it also had an emulation of a cabinet to try and give you the sound of a cabinet in the room. It also had this fabulous floor unit that you could use to either change the channels or you could switch your effects off and on. So this thing became incredibly powerful. This thing became the unit that everybody had to have. The Edge from U2 used one not just for recording, but used it on tour as part of his massive effects rig that he still uses to this day. I think he may even still have that in his rack. This one here has been sitting in my upstairs loft for about, 10 years now. I stopped using it when I finished my first album, but it was an absolutely fabulous unit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back in time to around about 20 years ago and explain to you the sounds that I used from this device to get my guitar sound and what is still my guitar sound to this day. I've played around with some of the settings because when I listened to it out of the box, untouched for 20 years, it didn't quite hit the highs that my guitar sound has today, but it still sounds fabulous in a mix. When I go back and listen to those original tracks, they still sound very, very good. And actually, when I use this device today with a couple of tweaks, I've got very close to the sound that I have today that I wouldn't change. So I probably could have stuck with this, but don't tell the wife that. Welcome back. I'm going to play it now so you can actually hear what this 20-year-old technology sounded like. I'm going to play the beginning of the track Halloween, just 2 simple chords, just so you can get a feel for it. Pretty good. Now, what I've also got running in the computer is amplitude. Now, amplitude is effectively a digital model of a Mark V amplifier. Now, after about 6 years of using the Pod XT Pro, which again, I did about half an album with that piece of kit, I had the chance to buy the latest Mesa Boogie, which was the Mesa Boogie Mark V, and that was a fabulous amp. The version I had a head and a separate cabinet, and in the room it sounded massive because you had this 1x12 closed back cabinet that pushed air right through the room. It was a 90 watt amplifier, so I could never use it at full power. I used to use it in reduced power mode, but for recording I used a Palmer speaker emulator, which meant that I could take the output from the amplifier, put it through the speaker emulator, and then into the computer. And I recorded the second half of the album with a real Mark V in the room, and it sounded brilliant. But when we listen to what it sounds like in the track when captured through a microphone simulator, which is what the Palmer speaker emulator did, the sound isn't anything like as big. It still sounds great, but we'll plug it in now. I'm just switching the output to another input on the computer. So I've just switched the input from the guitar into the model of the Mark V, which is up on the screen here. Let's play that. Now, what I omitted to say was the model of amplifier that I was using in the Pod XT Pro was a Mark IIc, which is the amplifier that was used by Metallica, Dream Theater, a whole bunch of kind of metal-y bands used that Mark IIc. It was the holy grail of amplifiers, and it was actually the Mark IIc circuit that was used to make the Mark IV and Mark V amplifiers. So all the Mesa Boogies that came after the Mark II were really just souped up versions of the Mark II. So this is the Mark II. Through the 20-year-old Pod XT Pro, here is a real Mark V modelled, but in the computer. I sold the Mark V because it was just too big. It was like the elephant in the room. It was a huge beast of a machine. So about 6 years ago, Line 6 came out with the new version. They've actually gone through a number of iterations. They had one called the HD 500, which I didn't really get on with. I couldn't get the sound I wanted out of that. It was because it didn't have a Mesa Boogie Mark IIc emulation. It had a dual rectifier, which is way too much bottom end for me. They brought out the Helix, which I decided not to buy for the first year because, again, it didn't have the amplifier that I wanted. As I tried it in the shop and I was absolutely blown away because it had the amount of amplifier possibilities, but also the number of effects you could have along with those amplifiers was quite bewildering. So I ended up buying it. And then when I got home, I found out they'd just released a Mark IV amplifier emulation, which I immediately downloaded. And because I'd spent, it took me a long time to get the Mark V amplifier sounding the way I wanted it. It took me months and months and months, but I actually had a picture of that amplifier with the settings, and those are the settings that I've used in here in Amplitude. I've literally taken the knob settings that I had on the picture of my amplifier, dialed them in here, and so I know I'm getting the right sound. I put the same pedals in front of it. I use a tube screamer in front of the amplifier. If you put a tube screamer in front of a Mesa Boogie amplifier, it does something that tightens up the mid-range a little bit and just brings a bit of tightness to it. But anyway, after I bought the Line 6 Helix. I'll show you the Helix now. Let's go over and have a look at the Helix. So this is the Helix on the floor here. This is an incredibly powerful unit, and I run it through a power cab. This speaker has a flat response, so it's more like a PA speaker than a guitar amplifier speaker, because the modelling of the guitar amplifier speaker is actually done within the Helix. And there's a ton of effects that I've got there. So I can control my channels, they're all colour coded. I've got clean, which is green, crunch, which is yellow, lead, which is orange, and then I've got a solo channel. Now each of these channels changes multiple effects within the Helix unit. So this is a fabulous unit. And I've gone one further. This unit I've used for about 6 years now, but I get confused because there's so many options. I've got to remember which switches I had switched on if I record the track into the computer, and that can become a bit bewildering. My old approach was to record quite a dry track into the computer and then add the effects in there. That way I never had to remember what effects I had. So what I've got down here is my new rig. And it's basically an Ibanez Tube Screamer. Just ignore the Sewer Riot because that came free with something. Then that runs into the Tonex, which is Amplitude's amp capture modeler. The thing I'm running on the computer is Amplitude. That's a modeler where they've modeled the amplifier. The Tonex is amp capture. They've mic'd it up in such a way that they have recorded how that amp sounds in the room with those particular settings. And I've basically I found a capture that sounds almost identical to the way that I had the amplifier set up in Tonex. So the final thing that I want to do is I want to play each of the 3 setups. The original Mark V, then I'll play the Helix, and then I'll play the Tonex. And I think you'll be astounded at how similar they sound. This is the Mark V amplifier in Amplitude, but effectively a dry guitar signal going into the computer, and the computer is producing the amplifier sound. Now if I switch, we're now going through the Helix over there. And if I switch it again, we're going through the Tonex down here. Now in the room, my preference is for the Tonex. Because it's a full amp capture, it's captured the dynamics of the room as well as the amplifier, so it feels a little bit more airy to me. I won't hear that in a mix, because when you have all the other tracks in there, you just won't hear it. It'll get lost. But to my ears, that sounds better. If we go back to the Mark V in Amplitude, still very good. I can't use the Mark V in Amplitude because my computer just can't handle the number of guitar tracks that I'll use in a song. So it's a great sound, but it's just not usable for me. The Helix was probably the best unit all round, and I'm keeping it, I'm not selling it. I'm using the Helix for live playing when I want to have lots and lots of effects and I want to emulate other people's guitar sounds. I can switch to Marshall amps, Soldanos, I can switch to pretty much anything I want, and I've got rigs all set up in there for different amplifiers. But I always keep coming back to the Mark V because I've got a sound there that's consistent and one that I like. So to finish off with, I'm going to play 2 things. But a year ago I went back to the original recordings from the Hellenbach album that used the Pod XT Pro. And what I did was I double tracked the guitars using the original sound, but then I also added the sound of the Helix. And it's actually going to be quite useful because we can go back to the track and we can play it, and I can then switch the guitar sounds from the original XT Pro and the helix. And we can just have a listen in real time to the differences in the sounds and how they sit in a mix. So let's just give it a try. You'll hear the Pod XT Pro in the left-hand channel, and you'll hear the helix in the right-hand channel. Probably best if you use headphones for this, because what I'll be doing is I'll be switching between the channels, so you'll hear it flipping from ear to ear, and it's a good way of actually comparing one sound against the other. So let's give it a go. We'll start with the XT Pro in the left-hand channel. Well, I think we've proved the point. To my ears, I can hear slight differences, and I think it's because in the Line 6 Helix, I've actually used less effects. I like to get a drier sound into the computer these days. I think with the XT Pro, the delay is a little bit more stronger and maybe a little bit more distortion. Again, that's another thing. These days I like to use less distortion. I kind of believe that if you get the cleanest tone into the computer that you can possibly get, then you can do all sorts of stuff after the fact. The trick is to get a good sound into the computer. So I can't tell the difference. Now for the final trick, I'm just going to run through them all, one after the other. Now I'm going to switch this. Let's go back to the Pod XT Pro, because that was all the newer versions. So now the first thing you hear is the Pod XT Pro, Helix, Tonex. Pod XT Pro, Helix, Tonex. So I think the point I'm trying to prove here is the gear is irrelevant. I think what's most important is you've got to have in your head the sound that you want to create and create over and over again, because you know it's going to sound great in a mix and it is your sound. How you get there is entirely up to you. There are so many modelers and units available that the choice is bewildering. But I think if you've got the right model of amplifier and a good set of ears, you will get something that gives you the sound that you want, and you can get it over and over again. And I think the other thing I wanted to prove was this thing's been sitting up in my attic for 10 years. I've pulled it out, it still works, and it's still very close. I could have probably used that all along, and like I said earlier, for goodness sake, don't tell the wife. But that is how I get the consistent sound that I've used now for recording for nearly 20 years for the Rubicon Project. That is the Rubicon Project lead guitar sound. Thanks for watching.